Welcome, friends. We will let folks make their way in from the waiting room and get started in just a second. All righty. Well, welcome. Thank you to everyone joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn. What do the election results mean for climate and the environment? And thank you to everybody who is watching this recording. Last week's elections are behind us, and one thing is for sure, the outcomes will challenge the path forward for climate policy and environmental protection. We are all processing and reacting and planning and picking up the pieces in real time. And if you're anything like me, you could use a little help making sense of it all. Luckily, we have a Lunch and Learn program for that. We have with us today two of my absolute favorite people. Sara Chieffo is the Vice President of Government Affairs at the League of Conservation Voters, and Cathy Breen is MCV's own Director of Government Affairs. Together, they are going to walk us through the results of elections at both the federal and state levels and offer some insights on what that means for all of us who care about climate action, defending our democracy, and addressing the many pressing environmental challenges we face in the years ahead. Cathy, Sara, it's been a busy stretch. Doesn't look like it's slowing down. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Kathleen Neal. I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to building a just, thriving future for all by acting on the climate crisis, protecting the environment, and safeguarding our democracy. MCA does that by bringing people and organizations together to educate, inspire, and advocate. MCV does that by advocating for equitable policies, holding elected officials accountable, and winning elections. And if you are a Lunch and Learn regular, you have noticed that this slide looks a little bit different than usual because we don't often have the Maine Conservation Voters Action Fund organization and mission up there, but we do in fact have a political action committee or a PAC that gets involved in elections. Cathy's going to tell you a little bit more about the work that we did, and just want to give a shout out to that other member of our family of organizations. A few notes before we dive in. We're going to start with Sara and the federal election results, move to Cathy and the results here in Maine, and then tackle questions for both presenters following those presentations. As always, you can send your questions whenever they occur to you to either me or Maggie. We will get them organized and ask as many of them as possible. If you have any technical difficulties today, Maggie is the one to help you out. This event is being recorded. Later this afternoon, we'll post the recording on our website, on YouTube, and we'll send it to you in an email that will include some additional steps to follow up and keep taking action. I think that does it for table setting. And Sara, I will turn it over to you to tell us what just happened.
Kathleen, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Thank you so much for the deep partnership that the League of Conservation Voters has with our affiliate here in Maine, but also in 32 states across the country. Our collaborative work is more needed and more important and more powerful than ever. Before I pull up some of the slides that we're going to run through today, again, I'm Sara Chieffo. I'm Vice President of Government Affairs, the League of Conservation Voters. I do talk too fast. I will make sure I try to slow down, but we got a lot to cover. And I've been at LCV for 15 years now. And so I have the benefit of a long-term perspective on where climate policy and politics have been and pendulums swinging. And we have our work cut out for us, but I am confident together we can continue to make progress. So like MCV, LCV builds power for people and the planet. We focus on tackling the climate crisis, confronting environmental injustice, and strengthening our democracy to build cleaner and healthier communities, good, well-paying union jobs, and a just and equitable and sustainable future for all. That mission, that vision, that work did not change with last week's pretty devastating election results at the federal level. Let me go ahead and start sharing my slides so we can get into the meat or tofu of it, however you want to say. All right. Go ahead and do slideshow. Are we coming through? Okay. Okay, great. So let me offer just a top of the table reflection on the elections. There are, as Kathleen said, profound implications for climate action, for environmental protections, and for our democracy. But this election was not about climate. Investments in climate action, clean energy progress, cleaning up pollution, and good jobs remain extremely popular. And in states where we campaigned on these issues the most, the swing to Trump was half of what it was in non-battleground states. And in all but one of the battleground states, and I'll run through this more with slides in a minute, the pro-environment, pro-democracy Senate candidates won. So I don't want to sugarcoat it. Our work ahead is hard, but we must continue fighting for climate justice and a more equitable society. We always knew state action was going to be incredibly important in tackling the climate crisis and has become even more important given that we're going to be on defense for the near term at the federal level. I'm grateful to be in this fight with the powerhouse of Maine Conservation Voters and our state partners. And I want to say thank you all for being here today, for being engaged. We need you engaged. We need you to stay engaged in the weeks and months and years ahead. So our goals this election cycle, I'm going to first half of my presentation, we'll go through our electoral goals, the work we did, some of the results, and then we'll dig in a little bit on the path ahead. So our goals going into this election were to win the White House, to flip the United States House of Representatives, to keep the Senate, and to win in the states. And while we came up short on many of these fronts, there were bright spots. But before we dive into those results, I want to share a little bit about the work that the LCV Victory Fund, the part of our family of federal organizations that did a lot of this work in coordination with our state partners, like here in Maine. So here's a little bit more about, by the numbers, what we did. LCV Victory Fund and the Conservation Voters Movement made our biggest investment ever in defeating Trump and electing climate champions up and down the ballot. LCV Action Fund endorsed 220 candidates for the United States Senate and House, as well as, of course, Vice President Harris and Governor Walz. This cycle, we invested an impressive $164 million, including a record-breaking $33.4 million in our field efforts. These are the conversations that really move voters on the door. And we knocked on over 3.5 million doors. We raised a staggering $58.8 million directly for candidates through our bundling program called Give Green. We do that in partnership with a few other organizations. And we spent $2.5 million on our Green Roots or membership mobilization program. We had 25,000 volunteer shifts completed. So be proud of what the climate movement did as part of this election. We are really proud of this program. It wasn't enough to overcome the headwinds we were facing, but it made a big difference in a number of the races down ticket that I'll talk about. Here are some of the happy photos for folks as part of the Green Roots program. We also try to be innovative in our work and to learn each cycle about what works better and to try new things. This cycle, I want to highlight a few things that we did. We partnered with Future Forward, the super PAC that was sanctioned by the Biden and then Harris campaign, as well as partners like Climate Power, Environmental Defense Fund Action, and we launched $55 million in advertising campaigns on our issues. We are still collecting data to see the full impact of those, but this is a major data point that our issues are popular and we should be running on them. For the first time ever, our independent expenditure field program included House races where we made a real difference. For example, in New York's 4th Congressional District, was a handful of one of the Republican-held districts that we were able to flip. Our program knocked on 12,000 doors. That's twice the 6,000 vote margin that incoming Congressman-elect Laura Gillen won by. We work with content creators and even some celebrities to partner and get out our word. And I think this is a really important lesson for us coming out of this election is we need to meet people through different avenues through which they get their information and who they look to get that information. We partnered with celebrities like the singer Billie Eilish and the actor and environmentalist Leonardo DiCaprio to promote our work and our content to their audiences. For the first time ever, we also had a central climate candidate guide that got over 86,000 views in the final days of the campaign, which is a really important asset we're going to continue moving forward. All right, so these are probably way too many numbers for you to read in small font on one slide. So I'm going to give you a cheat sheet here. Of course, at the top of the ticket, we were devastated by the results of the presidential race. There's no two ways about that. Trump won all 7 of the swing states, and we saw significant rightward shifts across the country. We are taking the time to avoid hot takes and to really analyze the data to understand what is happening in America. And it appears, at first looking at that data, that not only was turnout down in Democratic areas, but also Vice President Harris lost ground with key constituencies like younger men under 40 and Black and Latino voters, primarily driven by men. We need to keep taking the time to analyze these, and we'll do that over the weeks and months ahead and use that to build more powerful and meaningful programs and reaching more voters in the campaigns ahead. Here's a little bit more on the House. This is also an eye test for those who can see all these different colors. Let me call out here. So this is our goal in the House was to flip the House. We were not successful in that. The Associated Press has called 218 seats for the Republicans, the exact number they need for the majority, with 8 races still uncalled. Some of these races are so close that we believe they're headed to recounts. So the exact balance of the U.S. House is not clear yet, but we do think there's a path for the House to end up at the current split it's at with 214 Democrats and 221 Republicans, including the very frontline in endangered district of Jared Golden getting reelected here in Maine's 2nd Congressional District. So here, just to get you the color coding, we have a couple of different buckets of races that we think about. We had our pickup seats for who we were trying to boot out because of their anti-incumbent records. That's the red block here. We had additional pickup opportunities. That's the sort of yellower opportunity here. And then in light green, we had champions to protect, and then open champions and champions in likely in close races. If we have them highlighted in blue, they won. And if we have it highlighted in orange, they're not yet called. So to sort of zoom out, the path to the House majority ran mainly through districts in California and New York. Democrats were able to flip 3 of the 5 most competitive seats in New York, but so far I've only flipped 1 in California. We're still digging into why that is, but that is the results we have right now. There are 2 Republican-held seats that could flip and are still, and a third that could go to a recount. Outside these 2 states, though, Democrats failed to flip seats. We'd hoped to win in places like Arizona, Iowa, and Montana. And Republicans had a boost from the top of the ticket and defeated Democratic incumbents in Colorado, Pennsylvania, and they flipped an open seat in Michigan. So that is the House. We are still ending up with a very slim majority, and we will work with that dynamic to our advantage in the next Congress. All right, let's go to the Senate. So in the Senate, we had hoped to defend or even expand our majority in the Senate, but we always knew this cycle was a really tough match for incumbent Democrats, with senators who were long time in office, but in deep red states like Montana and Ohio, where Trump's strength at the top of the ticket was just too much for Senators Tester and Brown to overcome. We did, however, manage, and I alluded this on the front end of the call, that we managed to win almost every Senate race in a presidential battleground state. We reelected Senator Rosen in Nevada, Senator Baldwin in Wisconsin, and holding open seats in Arizona and Michigan with 2 House incumbent members who ran for Senate seats in Ruben Gallego and Alyssa Slotkin. All of those will be very strong allies as we go on defense in the months and years ahead. And they all ran ahead of Vice President Harris in their races, perhaps stating the obvious there. Now let's turn to Pennsylvania, where Senator Casey is currently 0.4% behind David Cormick, with over 80,000 provisional ballots still uncounted and an automatic recount starting. So it's still tough, but there is still hope that Casey could squeak through. All right, so let's look quickly at the state races. This was sort of our fourth priority area to play on. We had mixed success in state level races, but I want to highlight some of the positives, including keeping pro-environment majorities here in Maine. Huge kudos. I know Cathy will go through that in great detail. We also held on to the Pennsylvania House, where Democrats had a one-seat margin going into the election and came out with a one-seat margin despite the losses at the top of the ticket. I think there are really important lessons to be learned there as we dig into the, keystone state of swing states of Pennsylvania. We also elected a true climate champion in Josh Shapiro as governor of North Carolina, and winning most of the statewide races in North Carolina, despite Harris's loss. And we also broke Republican supermajorities in 3 Trump-held states of Montana, North Carolina, and Wisconsin. So that is my deep dive on what are definitely not the outcome I wanted to be presenting to you all on, but it is where we are. And I want to really reiterate, it's important that we take the time to learn from this, to learn what voters are telling us, and also to know what has been working and what programs we need to deepen and continue on. So let me conclude with just a little bit of where we are focused right now on federal climate action. So 3 areas here for me to run through. We are working on running through the tape with the Biden-Harris administration and the remainder of their 2 months in office. We're working with partners across the climate, environmental justice, and labor communities to ensure that the Biden-Harris administration really maximizes the progress in the remaining time that they have. This covers a broad sweep of things that we're looking at, so I'll highlight a few areas. We're working on finishing rules critical to protecting public health, especially in environmental justice communities that are overburdened by pollution. We're also working with EPA to put out stronger public record about the data and the science they've collected, because we know the incoming administration will try to hide all of that and will put industry hacks in place of those, in charge of those agencies. We're also working to stop the build out of fossil fuels, which we know is a really important part of our continued climate progress, with the chief action item there being working with the Department of Energy to ensure that we reject pending liquefied natural gas export facility permits, and also put in place stronger records that truly take into account the economic, the environmental justice, and yes, the climate impacts of unfettered LNG exports. We're also working with the administration to push out as much of the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law investments as possible. This will help inoculate these investments from being clawed back. We think we're on pace for around 85 to 90%. I'm going to repeat that, 85 to 90% of the historic federal climate, clean energy, and good jobs investments that were in those 2 landmark laws to get out the door. That is a feat of Herculean government speed coming out of the Biden-Harris administration. We're also working to protect special places through designating national monuments within the president's scope of their purview and other conservation actions. And we are all eyes on the Senate as filling as many judicial vacancies as possible. So the short term here is judges, judges, judges. Chuck Schumer, don't recess until we get them all through. We're also working with partners in kind of the good government movement to make sure that we are archiving and publishing the data across the federal government, including on climate, but so many other issues. And then we're taking steps to protect career public civil servants from being targeted by the Trump-Vance administration. Second bucket here, and I'm about to wrap up and turn it over to Cathy, I promise, is we were preparing for the Trump-Vance administration. As I said at the top of the call, I was here for Trump's first term. Thankfully, I missed the first 4 months on maternity leave. I do not have the benefit of a baby to distract me this time, but I am all in to really build a powerful movement that meets the public where they are and really exposes the overreach and the true harm of what we know is coming our way. So within the progressive and environmental communities, we've got a 4-pronged strategy that is shorthanded as states, streets, suites, and courts. We're working on a major effort to advance climate progress at the state level here in Maine and across the country. We're working on mass mobilizations of public support against what the Trump-Vance administration will be throwing our way. We're engaging pro-climate corporations and holding accountable laggard corporations. And finally, working with sister organizations to wage a really significant and full blitz effort to try to stop or slow Trump's efforts in the courts. Unfortunately, Trump and the Project 2025 plan have made crystal clear that they're going to wage an outright war on climate science and policies. A few lowlights here for you. Trump has vowed to be dictator on day 1, and saying that he wanted to do that to expand drilling everywhere. A second Trump term means walking away from our international climate agreements and the Paris Climate Agreement, repealing federal climate regulations where they can, seeking to eviscerate the Inflation Reduction Act's investments, talk about that in a minute, undermine the shift to clean energy and clean vehicles, and expanding fossil fuel production. We're also worried that they will slash agency budgets or seek to, but they need congressional partnership to do that. And as I said earlier, pushing out and undermining career staff and even gutting EPA's ability to tackle climate change. They're also very clear they want to go after core public health and environmental justice progress. We know they're going to go after regulations on pesticides, forever chemicals like PFAS, things that are really kitchen table issues for families. And it is incumbent upon all of us to use those fights to both defeat where we can, but also build power in waging our pushback on their agenda. We unfortunately know that the second Trump term is going to be more extreme and dangerous than the first term, where they rolled back more than 100 environmental rules. They're more prepared. They've learned from the mistakes they made in their first term of rushed and sloppy repeal efforts, and they're working with a more sympathetic judiciary. Those are all big challenges for us. But we're going to be working with climate champions in Congress, with partner organizations across the progressive movement and in the clean energy industry to really push back on these assaults and to really make a contrast with Trump's failed promises to better people's lives and really expose what they're doing, which is an extreme agenda that prioritizes polluter allies over what's best for people's lives. And we have our eyes crystal clear focused on the midterm elections and winning back the House and more seats in the Senate. It's going to take all of us to do this. We're working closely with blue states, governors, attorneys general, and more to push back on Trump. Let me provide a little bit of, I think, silver lining hope in this third bucket, and then I'll turn it back to Cathy. So we've really have our work cut out for us to protect the historic Inflation Reduction Acts from congressional attacks. We're gearing up for a major fight with the Trump-Vance administration and Republicans in Congress to protect these historic clean energy and climate investments. The expiring Trump tax cuts that come due next year is going to be a near-term fight, perhaps in the first 100 days of Congress, that they're going to try to speed through tax cuts for billionaires and try to pay for them by repealing our clean energy investments. But we are here to tell you that we have a strong plan to push back on that, and we have a real chance for success and a lot of factors on our side. First of all, we've seen this with the Affordable Care Act. It is much harder to take things away when they've been implemented. We're leveraging industry support. You've seen a lot of the businesses that have received support and have reopened factories or in batteries and manufacturing and the rest to really push the administration. This is real economic impacts of rolling back these investments. And as I said earlier, we're in razor thin margins in especially the House Republican caucus. And we're working to really peel off even a slim number of Republicans are enough to make sure that these cuts don't get into this awful tax bill. Looking to the Senate, Senator Susan Collins will be critical in working with new senators like Senator Curtis in Utah to provide some moderation, hopefully, on not going after these clean energy investments. So to defend these investments, we're undertaking a couple of main tactics, centering the impact of repealing these. I'll note the majority of the clean energy investments have been in Republican-held districts. That's an asset for us going into this. We're working with state affiliates, including in more Republican or purple states in Idaho, Indiana, South Carolina, Nebraska, and elsewhere to really center the benefits of these investments and the costs of rolling them back. We're working on elevating stories of real people impacted by these investments to put a face on these investments. And we're doing on-the-ground organizing and storytelling to really drive home the consequences of lost jobs, higher energy prices, and ceding clean energy leadership to China as consequences of rolling back these investments. So that's it for me. I just want to conclude by saying how grateful I am for the deep partnership that we have with Maine Conservation Voters. I want to thank you for your engagement, and I believe we really can fend off a number of these attacks, including on the historic climate investments. And it's going to take all of us to do that in a way that builds power for the long term. Look forward to working with you all in that endeavor.
Thank you so much, Sara. We already have a zillion questions, but as I said at the top, we're going to hear from Cathy for the state level analysis, and then we'll open it up and tackle everything at once. So hold tight, and folks who are continuing to think about questions for Sara, you can keep sending those, and Cathy, you get to be the palate cleanser and tell us about a little bit happier news here in Maine.
Oh, and here, just gonna,
Yeah,
there we
thank you. Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, Sarah. That was a lot, and it was great information. And as Kathleen said, I get to share some really good news that happened here in Maine. Um, as you know, Maine Conservation Voters Action Fund was involved in some key legislative races here in Maine. And we had our endorsement program, which I handled. So we endorsed 31 state Senate candidates and 87 state House candidates. And we made concerted investments in 20 House races and 8 Senate races, all in all, investing over $200,000. And this year did a really robust field program in several targeted districts and did a lot of direct mail, digital ads, and uh, lots of innovative messaging to voters this year. Next slide, Maggie. Thank you. So fortunately, we returned a pro-environment, pro-democracy majority to both the Maine Senate and the Maine House. 22 of our 31 endorsed candidates won in the Senate, and 68 of our 87 endorsed candidates won in the House. So we have really a nice, comfortable majority in the Maine Senate and a little bit of a slimmer majority in the Maine House, but there are a bunch of races there that have recounts. So these numbers are accurate today, but they could change by next week or 2 weeks from now. So hang tight on the final numbers of House and Senate in Maine, but the majorities I think will hold. Next slide, please. Senate leadership, huge change from the 8 years that Troy Jackson ran that caucus, and six of those years as Senate president. The new Senate president is Maddie Daughtry. The new majority leader is Teresa Peirce. I know it looks like it's Pierce, but she says it Peirce. And then, of course, Jill Dewson is the assistant majority leader. And all three women here are from Cumberland County, which is an interesting fact. In Senate leadership is returning Senator Trey Stewart from Aroostook County and Matthew Harrington, who's from York County. New House leadership as well, although 2 are returning to leadership. Ryan Fecteau was not leader this term, but won in the 130th. He was the speaker then. Matt Moonen was also majority leader in the past, not this past session, but he is an experienced majority leader. And Lori Gramlich is new to leadership. She actually has been chairing the Environment and Natural Resources Committee, so she is very much very familiar with many of our issues. Speaker Fecteau is from York County, Matt Moonen is from Portland, and Lori Gramlich is also from York County. And Republican is returning Billy Bob Falkingham, and then a new leader from the greater Augusta area named Katrina Smith. So we are very optimistic. You know, we still have the Governor Mills, who is a real champion on climate in Maine. And there's, as you know, Maine Conservation Voters folks are very involved on the Climate Council. There are reports coming out on Maine Won't Wait 2.0. And so whole new set of recommendations and updated plan will be coming out next week. In addition, the Resilience Commission that the governor put together last year in the wake of those major storms last spring has put together their recommendations. So all of those are getting teed up now in the departments. Some of those initiatives will undoubtedly be in the governor's biennial budget proposal that she will release in January. And I'm sure there'll be lots of legislation that addresses some of those issues. So obviously, we have a lot of threats from the federal side. We also we have benefited a lot from federal investments in our renewable energy infrastructure here in Maine. And so we will be fighting to continue that. Um, it's amazing that we have such amazing partners at LCV, and we will continue to work with our federal delegation here in Maine on those federal issues. The other thing I wanted to point out with these majorities is that it's very likely that our AG Aaron Fry will be reelected, and Secretary of State Shanna Bellows is likely to be reelected by the legislature. And as we know, those folks are seasoned and they are already very active in their organizations, the Democratic AG's organization, Democratic Secretary of State's organization, and they will no doubt be working with their colleagues in the states across the country to push back on all sorts of things in the Justice Department and criminal law and immigration law, democracy, voting, all those areas. So we have really good champions that'll be returning to those roles in the coming months and 2 years. So I think I'm going to stop here, and I think Kathleen, are you going to be the one moderating our questions?
Yes, that's exactly right, Cathy. And before we get into questions, though, I do just want to take a second to let everybody know what to expect this afternoon. You will get a follow-up email with a link to this recording, which you are welcome and invited to share far and wide. Uh, in that email, as well as the recording, you'll also find a link to a petition. We know you knew when you signed up for this program, you knew when you logged on today, and you definitely know now that the stakes for climate and environment have never been higher, and that we have already seen a just mind-boggling list of nominees. We know there are extreme policies that got a lot of airtime on the campaign trail and we're bracing for. We know we need strong federal leadership to safeguard the progress that we have made and to prevent rollbacks. We're going to share a petition that makes it really easy for you to let Maine's federal delegation know that we expect them to stand up for climate action, to stand against attempts to weaken environmental protections, to stand up for democracy. We're going to I remember back in 2016 putting all of my congressional representatives' phone numbers in on speed dial, and if they fell off, if you got a new phone in the last 8 years, it is time to add them back in. They're going to need to hear a lot from us, and MCV is here to help you make those connections. So first up is the petition, and we will keep going from there. Thank you all for your many terrific questions. You can keep those coming through the chat, and we're going to try to answer as many of them as possible. And Sara, I might start by asking you, you said something at the very top about not being tempted too quickly by hot takes. What's the danger of listening to those hot takes on the election? What should we be, how do we make sure that we're learning real lessons, not just the spin? Garbage analysis is what someone called it this week, and I kind of like that.
Yeah, great question, Kathleen. So I think it's important for us as a group that is involved as deeply in politics as we are to actually look at the data and the analytics of what worked, what didn't work with respect to the program we ran. One part of our innovation I didn't mention was we actually did a fair number of canvases across the country on accessing for your own home the incredible Inflation Reduction Act investments in ways that you can save you money, electrifying your house, energy efficiency improvements, home energy audits, transitioning to an EV, putting in a heat pump, going induction stove, right? So all these things. So, and we do need to analyze, like in areas we did that, did we restore more faith in government? And we're seeing initially from Wisconsin's on the ground work that it actually moved people's belief, because part of what we're struggling with here, I'll get back to answering your question more directly, is a distrust in institutions, a distrust that the government can do anything for you. And Congress approval ratings are in the teens, lower than they've ever been, right? And so we need people to feel like there are answers and support for them. In terms of the danger of hot takes, there's a lot of pressure on the talking heads and the spin rooms to come up with an immediate analysis. It's a ton of factors that got us to the place that we're here. And so I think some of the circle firing squad of pointing fingers, oh, it's this demographic group, or it's that demographic group. We really need to understand from voter turnout data at a really local level what actually happened. We also need to match that quantitative data with qualitative conversations, with really understanding, and you can do focus groups, you can do other pieces in terms of organizing and work on the ground, but it's clear people in this country are really, really struggling. I saw a statistic that 70% of families in this country have skipped meals to make basic ends meet, right? And so we really need to understand what's happening. And this election was the first time that folks had a chance to vote their grievances in the wake of COVID, or in the now COVID is here. And a lot of folks don't turn out for midterm elections. And so there is real pain and suffering in this country, and we need to really understand what's happening and how we go to that. So I think some of the spin room hot takes can reinforce people's pre-existing assumptions about demographic groups or assumptions about what's happening, but we have to take time to listen and learn and really look at the data.
Thank you for that. And that data takes time, right? One of the really smart political data nerds that we get to work with said this week, there is a huge difference between having enough data to know who won an election and having the data to know how they won the election in terms of all of those specific votes. What's the timeline for that? Is there a point that we should just sort of flip a switch in our heads and say, okay, this analysis is actually worth listening to?
Yeah, mark your calendars for April 27th. No, I'm teasing. There's not a one day, but it is a many month process. And especially for groups like LCV that ran as big of a program as we did, we actually get the data file back. So from the voter file, right? So we literally know, did we talk to that person? Where were they tagged? Did they move, right? Did we canvass them on the IRA investment benefits? And then how did they turn out to vote, right? How you vote is not public, but if you voted is, right? And we did tag people with whether or not they were supportive or not. So there's a ton of analytics. So I will say it takes, many months to unpack all of this.
So we'll be learning these lessons for a while, and we'll all be sort of crunching our own data, but also you talked a little bit, Sara, about some of those partnerships and just so everybody knows, Maine Conservation Voters Action Fund has similar partnerships at the state level. So we have worked really closely with progressive partners, the labor unions, the Planned Parenthood, that sort of partnership. So we're coming together to say what worked on your side, what worked on our side, where were the messages really strong. I assume you'll be doing that as well in partnership. All right. Let's move into, well, having just said all of that, I'm still going to ask this hot take question, which is, do you have a sense of the strengths of Democratic messaging and the strengths of the Republican messaging so far, or did I just pull the rug out on our very thoughtful, don't rush to analysis, and feel free to scold me.
Yeah, you're going to get a 5-yard penalty, Kathleen. I'm just teasing. I do think, having said all that we just said, I think it is clear, and I spent a lot of volunteer time on the doors in Pennsylvania. it is clear to me from those conversations, just anecdotally, that the Republican messaging was very understandable and got to values. Now, they were tapping into people's fear, distrust, like othering, right? It was, Kamala higher prices, Trump lower taxes, Kamala crime, Trump safety. Like literally, those were the yard signs. And so I think it is not there is some real messaging challenging. You sort of pair that against the opportunity economy, which is more cerebral, right? Having said that, I think the Harris Walz team ran an incredible campaign, and I do not want to point blame at them. We are seeing a trend across the globe of incumbent governments being thrown out because of the real inequities in our society. And I think the sort of ultimate injustice, or one of the injustices of this election, is that the policies that Democrats are behind actually help address those. But we couldn't communicate that. And I think we weren't connecting with people in enough ways, on enough channels. So many, I mean, how people get information is vastly different than it even was in 2020 in terms of how many people get information from podcasts, from influencers, right? This is a different world that we're in. And I think we have to look at how do we get out our messages. And there's a big, still big reliance on TV ads. That doesn't reach a whole swath of the country who just don't get their information that way. So I think there's a lot to unpack there, but I want to resist us from saying it's just a messaging challenge. I think it is a connecting with people and a how do we talk about values in a way that is understandable for folks and really gets to those issues. And I think it's really important as we push back on the Trump Vance attacks that we push back on them in a way that invites folks who supported Trump and Vance to come to our side. We don't push them away and say, see, this is what you voted for. Because I think the reality is most people did not vote for what is coming our way. Some part of Trump's base did, but a lot of folks didn't. A lot of folks are just fed up and feel like their lives were better when Trump was in office last time around. So they're low information voters. It's anyway, so there's a lot there. Sorry, I could go on too long, Kathleen. Back to you.
I really appreciate it. And Cathy, I want to turn to you because that story of incumbents being voted out and the sort of general frustration and genuine hurting that so many of our fellow Americans are experiencing right now. It didn't play out exactly that way in Maine. And I know we still have a lot of data to analyze, but I'm curious what your take is on, for example, in the Maine Senate, not a single incumbent lost their seat. And I don't know if that can be said of very many chambers across the country. So what's going on there?
Well, having served in the Senate Democratic Caucus for 8 years, I'm very aware of the program that the caucus itself runs, and it runs in partnership with MCV, Planned Parenthood, several unions, and a progressive coalition that works together on targeted races. And sort of the hallmark of the SDCC program is really connecting one-on-one with voters at their doors and knocking on thousands and thousands of doors and meeting people where they are, listening, doing constituent service right there. If there's something you need, I can go, I can make a call, help you out. It's a very sort of personal, interactive relationship sort of methodology, and also, really looking out for what people are needing in the moment and listening. And I want to go back to the point about, even though that we have sort of good economic indicators, inflation is going down, job numbers are going up, um, we are starting at new manufacturing sectors again. That's not the way people feel. People feel like things, and because it is really, really hard. And I think that not enough of our climate initiatives have reached enough people in Maine that they can really feel like they have a slice of the renewable energy pie. Far too many of our renewable energy efforts just aren't accessible to low-income people in Maine. We're working very, very focused on that issue in this upcoming legislative session so that we can really focus on clean energy for all and figure out how to make clean energy a right and how to make it accessible to every Mainer, no matter their income, no matter their medical condition, no matter their zip code. And that is really a laser focus for MCV in the upcoming legislative session.
Thank you, Cathy. And if you heard something in that sort of preview of what we're going to be working on, I promise there is more to come, and we will tell you about it in this space and in many other spaces. Um, Sara, you mentioned how much LCV has invested and with our partners or with the state leagues in pushing out information about the Inflation Reduction Act. And Cathy, you mentioned how much that federal funding has helped support programs here in Maine. And we've got a lot of questions about what happens to those programs. Um, and I think, Sara, I might ask you to start with the very first thing. For folks who have made an investment in 2024, put solar on the roof, bought a new EV, invested in insulation and energy efficiency at home, got one of those many heat pumps that we have so successfully adopted here in Maine. If you did that in 2024, will you get a tax credit in when you file in April?
Yes, so we are certain that for 2024, the tax code as it currently exists is firmly on solid ground. So get ready to, put all your paperwork together, get ready to file on all that. That is the case for consumers. It's also the case for nonprofits who are now, for the first time ever, and municipal governments eligible for those tax credits in the form of what's wonkily called direct pay. This is a big expansion of being able to access this funding for entities that don't have tax liability, right? So it is all in place for 2024. So we need to run blitz the field, run the zone. I'm not a football person, but whatever those phrases are, we need to do all that for 2024. I think there's a lot of uncertainty around that tax bill upcoming and what happens going forward. So that's why I took some time to really stress for you all what an important fight that is at the federal level. And I am cautiously optimistic that we have the right components to fend off repealing the vast majority of those investments. I think this is not a shock to anybody, but there's been the most attention to the electric vehicle tax credits. I think those are the most vulnerable. Of the pieces that are out there, but we don't stop there. So that's the tax side. If money has gone out to states or other partners like the Green Bank, for example, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, that money is contractually obligated to a second party. The Trump-Vance administration cannot claw that back legally. So there are ways to make sure that the money that's not just being announced, it actually has to legally be in the transferred to another entity to be fully protected from being clawed back. So that's part of what I meant when I say we're working on obligating or getting out all the funds. That's a little bit behind the curtain of what that all means. We also know the Trump-Vance administration is going to not go by the rules. And so they will also use tools that really try to break the federal government and claw back money. So I don't want to say it's all rosy here, but we're working with and confident that partners in the Biden-Harris administration have this front of mind and are being as creative and as ambitious as possible. One program area that I think is also under threat is, we talked about programs that center lower income families and households. the energy efficiency rebate program that was funded through the Inflation Reduction Act and is overseen by the Department of Energy. Many states have put out their programs, but many other states are in a protracted but importantly long process of getting those programs right. And so that's an area where we feel like there could be a lot of effort to claw back. And we think, bring on that fight, right? Try to take money out of people's pockets, right? So any rate, so I think some fights will be us on very strong ground, and that is one of them. So I'll stop there.
No, that's so good to know. And Maine was in that earlier batch of getting the home energy rebates, partly because we have such a strong system already in place through Efficiency Maine, a great track record. That's all great news for Maine, but if you play it out, it means the states that didn't already have that will continue to not have that, which is the opposite of what we're trying to do here. Um, is there a world where, I've seen a bunch of headlines, so many of the IRA investments, the Inflation Reduction Act investments are bringing jobs and resources and economic gains to red states. Is there a world where the Republicans suddenly realize that they love the IRA, or am I just grasping at straws here?
You are not grasping at straws, Kathleen. So this is an important part of the strategy because Republicans have control of both chambers in Congress and the White House. The strategy to protect these rests upon a number of congressional Republicans, starting in the House, because that's where this tax bill will originate, saying to Speaker Johnson, don't put these cuts in there. I can't support this package if these cuts are in there. And so that's the play we're working with industry partners on, and we will need local organizing around. But you've seen there was a letter this couple months ago from 18 existing House Republicans, 14 of whom got reelected, who are coming back, who are already right now being more vocal in the press and saying we shouldn't be going to these as pay-fors for our tax bill. And so it is there's going to be a lot of pressure exerted on those folks. And this is seen as a real political win for the Trump administration, who's called this a green scam. They've called these slush funds, right? So it is, from a strategic standpoint, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that there's enough noise made from enough Republicans. And given the very tight margins in the House, we don't even need all 14, right? We need a handful of those to just say, get this out. And we actually saw this in passing the Inflation Reduction Act. A ton of Democrats went to Chuck Schumer and then Nancy Pelosi to say, I can't be for Joe Biden's full vision for Build Back Better Act. I can be for these things, right? And so this is a tried and true part of the sausage making process. And we aren't always the best inside messengers with those Republican offices. We did try to defeat about half of those folks who are returning. But we are part of building the public pressure. And we are part of telling the story about what's at stake with rolling back these investments from the job angle, from the low. I mean, clean energy is still the cheapest option, right? So if you're rolling back these incentives, you're making energy more expensive, right? And you're making us more reliant on dirty fossil fuels. And people, that's not popular, right? So we're going to use all those arguments. And increasingly, people acknowledge the transition is underway to clean energy. And so if we roll back these incentives and stop playing in this space, we only hurt ourselves. And there are some in our coalition who will really lean into that as ceding ground to China. That's not a main message for LCV, but I think it is one that is quite potent for Republicans, given how much they have used that on their own ground.
And maybe there's also something there about, remind me, it was states, streets, suites, and suites is
courts.
our corporate partners, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, there's some real cognitive dissonance when the head of Exxon is saying, keep up the clean energy transition, but we'll take it, right?
Yeah, but Kathleen, one point here is, this is going to be a massive tax bill that gives handouts to those same big corporate interests. And so that's why we have to make sure that the cuts aren't in there in the beginning, because if we're trying to take them out, that's a much harder fight for us. And so I think the sequencing and the timeline is here. So it is cognitive dissonance, as you said, but how is Exxon going to choose between massive tax breaks, right, and these clean energy investments? So I think we have our work. It's a complicated playing field that we're on. We have our work cut out for us.
I am looking at the incredible list of questions that you all have and that we all have, and just saying we are not going to get to even a fraction of them. But there are a couple that I want to be sure to tackle before the end of the program. One is when we think about lobbying our federal delegation, and you're all going to get the petition to start that process again. I always chuckle at how much ground Maine covers with only 4 members of Congress, but boy, do we have a mix in there. And there's been a lot of chatter about the role that Senator Susan Collins might play. And Sara, I wonder if you can tell us what you're hearing in DC, because what we've seen in the headlines here in Maine is she may be the head of chair of appropriations. There may be something else going on. She's definitely running again. We should definitely be mounting a campaign. That seat will be up in 2 years. What's the word on the street in DC?
So Susan Collins is in a power position no matter what part of those things come to fruition or not. She's an incredibly important part of the Senate strategy of pushing back on some of the most egregious attacks we're going to see. I think especially in the appropriations space, I would be surprised if she does not take the chair role for appropriations. It is an incredibly powerful perch to have. And we know from what Trump has said on the campaign trail and Project 2025 that they're going to try to utterly gut important federal agencies that do everything across the board that we count on, whether it's health standards for food, or if it's protecting clean air and clean water, if it's worker safety standards, right? They're going to try to gut all those programs. And so Susan Collins will be a vital power player in that space, no matter what. And she's already shown, a willingness to speak out against a number of the truly egregious nominees to Trump's cabinet. And so it will take all of you to continue to raise your voices with Senator Collins because she will be under a tremendous amount of pressure. And we know this administration is going to be very punitive for folks who challenge them. And there will be real consequences, especially within the Republican Party, for folks who stand up to the Trump-Vance administration. This is all about loyalty in Trump's world, and crossing him will lead to a very long and painful 4 years. And so she's going to be a linchpin in the Senate strategy, no matter which exact perch she takes in terms of her leadership role.
All right, bump up her number in your phone. We're going to be reaching out quite a bit. And actually, honestly, if anybody is looking for opportunities to connect with Senator Collins, if you happen to have a personal relationship with her and you're thinking, I might want to use that in a different way, we are here for it. You can respond to that follow-up email later this afternoon and say, Maggie, what should I do? I want to get involved. And we're going to have a list for sure. Cathy, I want to close with you and this question that, so much of the work of our organization and of lawmakers and leaders across the state and people on the ground in the last few years has been about building out offshore wind in Maine and really building that industry in a way that grows good family sustaining jobs, that meets our clean energy goals. The new Pathways 2040 project from the governor's energy office has us relying pretty significantly on offshore wind energy. Is that all still happening?
Well, the Trump campaign certainly put a target on the back of floating offshore wind and any offshore wind. And the state was not successful in the first round of federal grants that we applied for and learned earlier this month that we were not able to secure a federal grant. But obviously, those leases that the Bureau of Energy Management put together, those are going forward. And the Offshore Wind Coalition that MCV staffs will absolutely continue to work together. It's a broad statewide coalition of environmentalists, community groups, labor organizers. And we are going to be working, no matter what happens at the federal level, we will be working to make sure that the ground in Maine is laid to continue with floating offshore wind when the federal administration changes. So whether it's working on, building local on the ground support, whether it's working with coalitions around what possible community benefits we might want to put forward when the port gets built in the future, continuing to work with the Mills administration and the governor's energy office, and continue to work with our allies around the state to keep marching towards floating offshore wind. We are not going to give it up. There might be a pause in the federal partnership, but we will continue to do work here on the ground and in the water in Maine to make sure we're ready when we have federal partner again in the future.
Thank you. All of our goals are long term. All of our work is long term. We will have near term calls to action today and every day going forward, but we're in it for the long haul. Cathy, thank you so much for giving us that behind the scenes look at what happened here in Maine. Sara, thank you for shedding so much light on what happened across the country and what's going to happen in DC and what it means for all of us. Thank you all for joining. It is tempting to turn away and stick our heads in the sand. Thank you for lifting your heads up and being with us in this crucial work. We are going to continue to make progress, and we need all of us to do it. Next week, we will be joining our friends at Maine Law for the 4th annual Indian Law and History Lecture. We'll hear from Professor Monty Mills and Dr. Suzanne Greenlaw on the topic of land back and the law. The lecture is hosted by the University of Maine School of Law. MCV is pleased to once again be sponsoring the event. You can attend on Zoom or in person, and you will find all the details in this afternoon's email. Until then, thank you all. It is wonderful to see your faces. It is wonderful to be in this fight with you, and I hope you have a terrific weekend.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you, Cathy.